Hi, and welcome to TCHL 834 Curriculum Development. Today we're going to really talk about building on current frameworks and look at what is out there as a model for evaluating tech integration in the classroom. So there's several frameworks that the textbook talks about. We want to break each of those down and really look at the pros and cons of those and how they can be implemented in the classroom to evaluate tech integration. And as we do that, we really want to focus on how does that framework examine if the technology is helping meet the learning goals. So one of the big questions we can ask ourselves is, why do we need a framework? Why do we really need to evaluate the technology in the classroom? Well, we know we need a strong theoretical and practical framework that allows us to look at the technology being used in the classroom and determine if it's truly helping us meet those learning goals. Is the tool effective? Okay, we do this in all kinds of things related to the classroom, whether we're evaluating our instruction, we're evaluating the curriculum, we're evaluating our learners, right? And so to be able to do that well, we have to have a framework that's really built on what does theory tell us about tech integration and what does theory tell us about student learning, and how can we put those pieces together to really evaluate the technology use in the classroom. So one of the things we want to look at in terms of a framework is how do we measure how learning is impacted by the technology. As a tech integration specialist or a library media specialist, that's the question you're often going to hear, especially when you're talking about curriculum development, making decisions about curriculum. How do we know that this tool that we have chosen is going to impact learning? So we really want to look at these frameworks in terms of, do they help us determine that? These frameworks can also help drive curriculum development. So if we do a pilot study, for example, on one-to-one access, if we don't measure the impact on learning and we just implement that program, then our curriculum development's really missing some key pieces there. But to help that curriculum development process, as classroom teachers are making decisions about textbooks, about standards, about sequencing of learning goals, that's where your role comes in as a library media specialist or a tech integration specialist, and say, hey, I know that these technology tools can impact learning in these ways. Or if you're implementing this in your classroom and we're evaluating the curriculum, we're in that evaluation process, here's a tool that I have that can help us assess whether the technology is helping us meet those learning goals. And so that's valuable for you as a tech expert in your building or in your district to be able to use that. Even if you're not in those roles yet, because I know many of us in this class are not yet in that tech integration or library media specialist role, as a classroom teacher with that knowledge, you can still help be a part of that curriculum development process and bring your expertise in what does technology look like when it's implemented within our curriculum and how do we measure it. The other thing that's really important is we all know, right, that funding is down. Our technology funding is impacted by that, right? And so if we have a framework where we can really evaluate if the technology is effective, it can allow us first to reduce costs. So if we're using some tools that we get in there and say, hey, you know what, this just is not impacting learning goals like we thought it was. It's a cool tool, it looks neat in pictures, but it is not having the impact on student learning that we thought it was going to have. We can reduce costs. But it also can help us support those costs. So if we really have a way to evaluate, hey, this technology has impacted the learning goals in this way, and we've documented it, we've done observations, we can give you this data on how it's impacting learning goals, building administrators, district administrators are going to be much more likely to take that information and say, hey, you know what, that really helps us support the cost of these tools that we can take to our Board of Education. And so it helps us in a number of ways when we're looking at cost of technology tools, whether that be devices, hardware, software, apps, whatever we want to talk about there. It can really help us in that conversation. So the first framework that they talked about in the textbook has a lot of long words. I like this one. TPAC is technological, pedagogical, content, knowledge. Okay, so this one was pretty detailed in terms of how does technology pedagogy, and content knowledge come together to really impact student learning. So it has multiple categories of things that we're going to look at. The one is content knowledge. So we know content knowledge, right? Content knowledge is critical for teachers to be effective. Okay, it's basically them understanding the fundamentals of their content area or the subject that they're teaching. Then we have pedagogy, right? We all learned about pedagogy when we were in our undergraduate programs. So what are the methods and procedures that we know are successful within our content area to teach, that we have mastery of that, okay? Then we have pedagogical content knowledge. So this one gets a little bit more detailed in terms of covering kind of what's the core business of teaching, learning, curriculum, assessment, reporting. How do we combine all those things, linking the curriculum, the assessments, the pedagogy to promote learning? So that's a little bit more complicated. New teachers coming out of undergraduate programs are still learning this piece because it's really combining that content and pedagogy together, okay? And this is something that even those of us who may be veteran teachers are always striving to get better at, is really blending all of these things, curriculum, assessment, and pedagogy together to be an effective teacher. And then we've got technology knowledge. So how knowledgeable is the teacher about the tools that she has access to or he has access to in their classroom? Are they able to use a smartboard? Do they have those basic technology skills to use a smartboard in their classroom or to use a one-to-one access and how to just use the tool itself? It's not talking about how we implement technology into learning. This is more the teacher's skill of using the technology tool. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here when I say we've got a whole range of technology skills in our buildings, right? You've seen that. You've got teachers who are really mastering any tool that they have in their classroom, and you've got some teachers that are still really probably struggling at times to use their laptop. So that technology really goes through a whole scope of skills that we would see in a building. And it's important to know, just kind of on a side note separate from curriculum development, to really remember that if you're in a support role where you're supporting a building or supporting a district's classroom teachers, that they are going to have a whole host of skills related to technology knowledge. Technological content knowledge gets a little bit more specific, and this is really understanding the manner in which the technology and the content can influence and constrain each other. Okay? Teachers really need to be able to master more than the subject matter that they teach, but they also must have a deep understanding of the manner in which the subject matter can be changed by the application of particular technologies. I took that away from the TPAC website where they really describe in detail what each of these represent. I think that's a good description. The other thing the author says there is teachers need to understand which specific technologies are best suited for addressing subject matter learning in their domains, and how the content dictates or perhaps even changes that technology. Okay, so this gets into not just using the technology to use it, but how is the technology influencing and advancing the content? Do we have the knowledge to be able to do that? That's a really hard skill for teachers sometimes to obtain because, you know, even in your tech master's program that you're in right now, you're really gaining those skills now through the graduate work that you're doing. Sometimes teachers gain those skills through professional development that their district does, or through continued support by a tech integration specialist or a library media specialist. But those are pretty specific skills that they need to be able to truly implement technology in the classroom. So when we're looking at curriculum development and that process, so I always want to bring it back to that, having those skills and being able to determine how does technology influence the content, that's an important skill to have when we're looking at scope and sequence of a curriculum and what tools we're going to use within that curriculum. Okay? And if you don't have that technological content knowledge, it's really hard to examine technology in that way to see if it's effective in improving learning goals. The final one is the technological pedagogy knowledge. Okay, so this is just understanding how teaching and learning can change when particular technologies are used. So again, this gets into how does the technology influence our theory and practices of instruction. So not how it influences the content, but how it influences our instruction. How does it help us ensure that students are actively engaged, that we're accessing their prior knowledge? Some of those big pedagogy theories and concepts that we know are effective in teaching, how do we tie technology into that? So that is one method. I want to go back to that real quick. That's one method of framework that's out there that's been adopted that schools can use to look at technology integration, okay, in the classroom within curriculum. You can see that this one may be a little complicated. And one of the things you're going to do during this module as you dig into these different frameworks is really look at what are the pros and what are the cons. So as you look at TPAC, I want you to be thinking about, and as you're reading more about it, what are things that would be really beneficial if I implemented this in my classroom or in my building? What are things that would be kind of barriers or would be cons or wouldn't really help us get to that end goal of how do we determine if the technology is impacting learner goals? Okay, so that's kind of what I want you to be processing as you're looking at these. The next one is the technology integration matrix, also called TIM. So it has 5 attributes that it looks at, and then 5 levels of tech integration. And this primarily focuses on pedagogy. So it doesn't really focus on the content. It's focusing on the teaching process or the theory behind the teaching. And you can kind of see here, talking about 5 levels of tech integration in this image that you see. So you've got entry level, okay, where you've got the technology in the classroom, but we're still learning how to use it. You've got adoption, so the technology is being adopted, they're using it more frequently, starting to use it in activities and lessons. Then you have adaptation, where it's really allowing the classroom teacher to adapt to the curriculum to integrate that technology. And you'll notice on this chart as we're looking at it, it kind of has conventional use of technology tools. Okay, so entry level is a very conventional use of the technology tool. For example, using a Word document to produce a written paper, right? That's pretty entry level, conventional use of a technology tool. All the way to complex use of technology tools. So here we could talk about, within transformation, using Skype to do an interview process of an author rather than writing a biography about that author, just by going to the library and reading information about them. So it's really transforming that activity to look completely different. One of the things that we're going to look at within the activity are some resources that are out there related to TIM. And this is a great video that you can take a look at. It's an ISTE presentation that was done a few years back at the national conference on TIM and kind of breaks down exactly what it is. So I think this will be important for you to take a look at when you're really digging into what are the pros and the cons of each of these models. Okay, here you can see those 5 levels of learning environments. So it goes from active, collaborative, constructive, authentic, and goal-oriented, okay, learning environments. And then you've got the 5 levels of technology integration. The main focus of this, again, is not on learner goals, and I think that's what we want to remember, but it's focusing on how technology is used with the student and if the tool is integrated in a sophisticated way. Okay? If you're looking at 5 attributes and 5 levels of tech integration, I will say that sometimes this can become time-consuming, a little bit cumbersome. If you think about walking into a classroom or really evaluating a curriculum and how technology is implemented, going through these 5 levels and 5 types of measurements can make this a little bit more cumbersome to use. Here's a little bit more description on what those levels are, and it kind of gives you some examples of what that would look like. So I just want to take a look at a couple here. Let's look at authentic learning. Okay, we know authentic learning is allowing students to use technology tools to link learning activities to the world, right, to real-world experiences. So if we look at this at entry-level integration, then the use would be really unrelated to the world outside of the instructional setting. Okay, so the technology use is really just impacting what's going on in that classroom within that instruction. It's not connecting to anything outside of the classroom. But if we jump to adaptation level, so there would be independent use of technology and activities, connecting students' lives or some student choice or to exploration. Okay, let's jump all the way to transformation level. Again, we're talking about authentic learning, so connecting learning to the outside world. This is transformation level would look like an innovative use for higher order thinking. Okay, really making connections to their community or to a global context. So that kind of gives you an idea of how you would look at how technology is being integrated within a lesson or within a unit by taking this table and really determining what are the characteristics of the learning environment and then what's the level of tech integration that's occurring there. The third framework that they talk about in the book is called substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. Okay, so SAMR, I guess we could call this one. You know, in education we always like acronyms, right? Or shortened versions of titles. I know when I teach in special education, we're full of them, right? IEPs, 504s, all kinds of things. So this one's called SAMR. So this one really is a simple model to follow. It's much more simple than the last one. And it examines how technology is being used in the classroom. So we have 4 levels here: redefinition, modification, augmentation, and substitution. Okay? Redefinition really looks at how technology is allowing for the students to do a new task, okay, that maybe was previously not something that they could do. Okay, an example of that would be the autobiography about an author that I was telling you about, where you could do a Skype interview with that author rather than going and reading about them in the library or online. Modification really allows the technology to kind of make a significant redesign to the task that we're asking students to do. So for example, if we have students write a story and they're going to hand draw images, kind of like a cartoon strip with that, a modification that would really change what that task looks like is to use an iPad and allow students to use maybe an art app or a clip art app where they're adding images and their own artwork to that activity. Augmentation really allows the technology to act as a direct substitute for another tool, okay, to really improve the function of the activity. So, for example, a really common one we see now in classrooms across the state is that switch from a chalkboard where teachers are standing in front of the classroom writing with the white chalk, right, getting white all over their clothes, to a smartboard. Okay, that's a perfect example of augmentation. And then we have substitution. So here the tech is really a direct substitute and there's really no functional change. Okay. I'm sorry, I messed that up there. Augmentation. Yeah, substitution. That's where we're really looking at the chalkboard versus the interactive whiteboard. Sorry about that. So substitution, that makes sense, right? There's no change in function in what the students really the function of as the teacher's standing above the class lecturing. You've got the chalkboard versus the smartboard. Okay. So it really doesn't look at, you know, we're not talking about learning goals here. We're not talking about how does the technology address those learning goals. We're just looking at technology and how it's transforming or enhancing classroom instruction. So again, as we look at those 3, I want us to always come back to these questions. Okay, why do we need a framework? Well, we know we need a framework so that we can determine how technology is being implemented to impact learner goals, right? We know that framework needs to be built on theory. It needs to be a practical framework that we can easily implement in the classroom or implement in our curriculum evaluation. And we need to make sure that it's really measuring how learning is impacted by technology, just not measuring the technology tool itself. And again, how's it going to drive curriculum development? I want you to really think about that. How could you use that tool to assist in that curriculum development process that you talked about in the last module and that you really learned about? How could it help with costs? Is it going to reduce costs? Is it going to help us support costs? What would that look like? Those are things we want to really think about as we look at frameworks.